Sometimes the devil is in the details, as they say. Other times you have to be able to step back and relax your eyes and just try to let yourself see the subtle yet sweeping arc of the picture, the broader vignette, so as not to miss the forest for the trees. I found myself doing both in the course of pondering this topic of atomism, and its larger, perhaps far underappreciated role in the development of what more and more of us are regarding as the modern religion of scientism. When we step back and consider this religion, which parades itself as being no religion at all, though it absolutely is, we can easily start to establish that it functions upon a foundation of several key philosophical assumptions, foundational concepts. Two of these concepts which have received a great deal more attention are the scientific assumptions of heliocentrism and evolution. Both of these core tenets of scientism have been demonstrated to have originated far back in ancient times, in the mystical spirit science schools of Greece and India. From a deeper biblical understanding, however, we know that these two ancient cultural centers were not separate, isolated centers of occult knowledge, but actually two branches of an even older source of Hermetic philosophy and mysticism, that is, Babylon itself. Babylon, in turn, was the resurgence of an even older tradition of occult knowledge and practice, which was the era of the pre-flood world, where fallen angelic beings had come down, sired the hybrid offspring known as the Nephilim, and also taught humanity a whole host of forbidden and abominable practices. And so with that perspective in mind, I've found it increasingly curious to realize that as we've been daring to question this monolithic edifice of scientism, and the many underlying theoretical constructs on which it has been built upon, this thread of atomism is one that, coincidentally enough, just like heliocentric and evolutionary cosmology, weaves its way back from our modern atomic age, back through the Industrial Revolution, through the so-called Enlightenment and the Middle Ages, to those same centers of Hermetic mysticism and pagan philosophy. Personally, I find it fascinating that all three of these, quote, pillars of scientism just so happen to have first come about not by way of true scientific experimentation and discovery, but through speculative philosophy. Is it really any wonder that theoretical physics holds such a monopoly over scientific, quote, advancement in our modern day and age, when we step back and realize that it was all ultimately founded upon theoretical physics from the outset? But what's also interesting, beyond just the philosophical inception of these things, is the route by which they took to get from those ancient Hermetic schools to our present-day universities and classrooms. And in the case of the path from atomism to the atomic age, we find some very interesting things indeed. Most people who are familiar with the term atomism know about its Greek history with figures such as Democritus and Plato, its basis on the central assumption of reductionism, the correlations to the concept of the four principal elements, and so on. But as is the case with many arenas of Greek philosophy, oftentimes the mystical and esoteric significance of those concepts gets lost, and which of course I'd argue that's probably no accident. But when we look to the counterpart sources of ancient atomism in India, the mystical ramifications of these ideas is far less opaque. An excerpt from the Bhagavata Purana reads, "The material manifestation's ultimate particle, which is indivisible and not formed into a body, is called the atom, Parama Anu. It exists always as an indivisible identity, even after the dissolution of all forms. The material body is but a combination of such atoms, but it is misunderstood by the common man. Atoms are the ultimate state of the manifest universe. When they stay in their own forms without forming different bodies, they are called unlimited oneness. There are certainly different bodies and physical forms, but the atoms themselves form the complete manifestation." So clearly, reductionism, that is, the idea that everything in existence is reducible to some sort of primary element or elements, represented by the various forms and conceptions of atomism, is another product of the mystery schools. It is an ancient occult teaching. It is something that for whatever reason the fallen spiritual deceivers of humanity have worked hard to inject into our thinking about the world around us. But why? I found the trajectory and trail of atomism to be most telling indeed when it comes to the stage of the manner by which it was largely carried through the centuries, from ancient to modern times. The vessel of preservation and dissemination was in fact the occult practice of alchemy, which coincidentally also factors into the histories and progression of things like Copernicanism and evolution. In fact, alchemy is almost like the nexus through which all these endeavors of astronomy, physics, chemistry really began to be incorporated into each other to form the early stages of our quote-unquote modern conceptions of universal mechanics. Alchemy was actually transferred from ancient Greece and India to medieval Europe largely by way of the Islamic alchemists who translated many of the volumes of Greek manuscripts and preserved and expounded upon them. In the 8th century, Jabir ibn Hayyan, which was later Latinized into Geber, introduced a more methodical approach to alchemy, with controlled experimentation in the laboratory. This experimental approach to alchemy and reductionism was later spread throughout Europe by way of a document called the Pseudo-Geber, because it claimed Geber as the ultimate source, yet its true author is unsubstantiated. In any case, the interplay between the spheres of alchemy and atomism is undeniable, and we see so many of the key historical figures commonly associated with alchemical and esoteric studies also being central to the revitalization of atomism in Europe. Figures as notable as Francis Bacon, Galileo, René Descartes, Pierre Gassendi. Eventually, the classical Greek atomism morphed into something referred to as corpuscularianism, which was the same basic concept of reductionism, only it allowed for the possibility that atoms themselves could be divided into even smaller units of matter. This modified form of atomism was championed by the likes of Robert Boyle, considered by many to be the founder of modern chemistry, and one of the most famous alchemists in all of history, Sir Isaac Newton. From there into the 1800s, our history books insist that this is where alchemy began turning into proper chemistry, mysticism giving way to science, and atomism finally becoming formulated as a formal mathematical theory by a man named Roger Joseph Boscovich, who was a philosopher, astronomer, physicist, mathematician, and a Jesuit priest. Into the 19th and 20th century, atomism eventually became formal modern atomic theory, bringing us all the way into the present day full of string theory and dark matter and large hadron colliders. The atom has long been split with fearsome destructive power or energy-producing possibility. The existence of this minutely vast quantum reality has been undeniably proven. Or has it? Do the pervasively occult origins of these theories have any remaining significance for us today? Is there some still yet undisclosed spiritual agenda behind all these supposedly innocuous and coincidental connections? Modern occultist Manly P. Hall certainly believed there was a great deal of esoteric significance to atomism, and he gave many lectures on the topic. Today we increasingly hear theoretical physicists and other materialistic scientists talking about an uncanny amount of similarity between the things modern quantum physics is claiming to discover and the sorts of things found in Kabbalism and other ancient forms of Hermeticism. Through the history of atomism, we can see this familiar trend of an original mystical philosophy gradually and painstakingly hammered into what is supposedly a purely materialistic and scientific knowledge base, which then, ironically enough, winds up coming full circle to where it begins pointing humanity back to that original underlying Hermetic belief system. Has humanity effectively been duped into building the machines that will serve as the key to freeing a horde of entities from a dimensional prison? Did fallen angels perhaps begin perpetrating these false cosmological and physical doctrines long ago, so that eventually we would believe we were acquiring the knowledge to achieve our own immortality, when in reality we were only playing God?
And even today, there is still this process of discovery going on. What we can clearly see in terms of the teachings in the Kabbalah, in the Zohar, is that there is no such thing as death. This is very important teaching. For example, you're driving along in your car and you see a little animal. He's been run over, it's roadkill, it's a shame. But in the true lessons of the Kabbalah, that animal is made of atoms which are described in the Kabbalistic texts. And atoms are miniature points of light. This is how they're described. They are particles which you cannot see with your eye, but they are the building blocks of everything in the universe. And that little dead creature, he is made of atoms, and those atoms are full of energy. And so the Kabbalistic texts and the tradition really breaks things down into particle theory. And what is really fascinating is that the oral tradition of the Kabbalah, teaching from father to son, mother to daughter, this, I suppose, a version of nuclear physics, was very strong in Central Eastern Europe. Okay? Where do all of the nuclear physicists come from? Niels Bohr, Szilard, Albert Einstein, the Oppenheimer brothers, Edward Teller, who invented the hydrogen bomb. If you look at their family histories, they all come from Central Eastern Europe, which is the geographical area where the oral tradition of the Kabbalah was its strongest in Europe. And I've just written a new book that's coming out tomorrow called The Real Dr. Strangeloves. And, it shows that the Kabbalah is now being written into quantum theory. Quantum theory with quarks and neutrinos and all these exotic particles traveling at 2/3 of the speed of light that are being discovered in these particle accelerators. If you know about the Kabbalah, which though people like Albert Einstein and Edward Teller definitely knew about the Kabbalah, you can see that it's almost like they're making quantum physics fit the Kabbalah.